Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about wisdom. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7, which is admittedly not in every Bible, but is in most, reads in the King James Version as, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting get understanding." Many modern Bibles translate wisdom as insight. I feel this does a disservice to the text. For you see, the Hebrew word that is used to translate it either as wisdom or insight is chokmah, which does mean having good sense or being skillful or being witful. There is no exact English word, of course that's true of most Hebrew words, but I feel wisdom encapsulates it better than does insight, and certainly encapsulates the meaning, and has more meaning to the English speaker than insight. And it is indeed the best way to render it in my view, and the most helpful to us in English. For insight is not the same thing as wisdom, and it is by wisdom that we should walk. And wisdom is the topic of this video. Of course, the Bible extols the virtue of wisdom, but is far from the only text to do so. The Quran does so as well, but so do the Hindu Vedas, and so do Buddhist texts, and so does the Tao, and so even do modern philosophers. Wisdom is one of those things that many praise the virtue of, but few seem to bother to exercise. Nevertheless, I would like to speak to you on wisdom. Contrary to the popular use of the word, wisdom and knowledge are not the same thing. Although they are related. Indeed, one cannot exercise wisdom without knowledge, so one could argue that wisdom is based upon knowledge. But wisdom is distinct from knowledge in a certain way. Wisdom is knowing the right application of knowledge. Knowledge is nothing more than an accruement of facts or data. And data is probably the better term, since one can know about things that are not true. This includes fiction, but one can also be mistaken. For example, if we were living in the medieval period, we may very well believe in the Ptolemaic system of the universe, in which the Earth is the center of the universe, and all of the other celestial spheres, the planets, the stars, and other objects, including the sun, orbit the Earth. This would be knowledge. We would have learned it from other learned men. But it would not be correct. Nevertheless, it would be knowledge. The difference between wisdom and knowledge, though, is knowledge tells you that the Earth is the center of the universe, and that the planets are the perfect orbs that go about the Earth, and that the sun, whilst not a planet, also orbits the Earth. Wisdom tells you how to apply that knowledge. Though to be fair, there's not much application to simply knowing the Earth is the center of the universe and the planets orbit it, be it factually incorrect or not. But combine that with the fact that you can keep time with it, and combine that with the fact that seasons on Earth change, and combine that all with the fact that people need to express certain aspects of their lives, and you can create a calendar. You can create holidays to celebrate certain things about humanity. You can create ways to express ourselves, which both utilize the knowledge that we have and improve our life and situation. This is indeed one of the reasons why I talk so much about the new atheism and militant atheism. Because one of the things they love to do is to demean religion, including and especially Christianity. And one of the ways they love to mock Christianity is by calling it Christian mythology. They do this because in our popular culture, we use the word mythology to describe stories that are not true. Something is a myth if it isn't true. However, in a way, they are correct in calling it Christian mythology, though not in the way they would understand. Academically speaking, a myth is not a story that's not true, a story that's made up, a story that only an idiot would believe in these days. Rather, a myth is an explanatory story that transcends its historical reality. Indeed, a myth could actually be something that is actually true. A myth can be an entirely true story. What makes it a myth is that the story acts as the embodiment of certain universal principles or truth that one holds to. So, whether the actual story is true or not, the actual principles which it conveys are at least understood as true. This is why, when I talk about mythology in the academic sense, I often point to the American Revolution, because it is largely a mythical event. I don't mean that the American Revolution never happened. I'm not even saying that a lot of what we think about the American Revolution isn't true, although in the latter end this is the case. While the American Revolution did indeed happen, it did not happen the way most people imagine it to have happened, and there are a lot of misconceptions historically about it. But that's not what makes it a myth. It isn't a myth because it never happened, and it isn't a myth because it happened, but the version we know isn't the true version. Rather, it is a myth because it embodies the principles on which America is founded and people's identities as American. It gives justification for why the nation exists, why it's not part of Britain, why Americans bow to no kings, and why Americans reject monarchy. It gives a reason why America exists, whilst at the same time embodying the courage of a small band of brothers fighting the most powerful empire, an exemplar of courage and bravery and fighting specifically for these principles. So, the story of the American Revolution, which Americans are introduced to practically from the day they are born, is one that is supposed to encourage them. It teaches them their identities as Americans, the values they are supposed to hold. George Washington was a historical person, but he's also the avatar for philosophical ideas, and it is this philosophical George Washington who is still alive, constantly fighting that American Revolution in a giant repeating loop that doesn't simply begin at one point, end, and then begin again, but is constantly at the very first shot at Lexington, whilst at the same time always at Yorktown and the surrender of Cornwallis. This ephemeral, timeless American Revolution that, on the one hand, has events that happened in a certain order, and on the other hand is all happening at once. This story where these men themselves serve as exemplars of virtue and truth, that is what makes it a myth. What's more, even the individual men have become mythic. George Washington is renowned for his honesty and his integrity, and people have been inspired by him, wishing to be like him. And that is the point. A myth encapsulates principles and philosophies and values. A myth embodies concepts of philosophical and esoteric truth. So whether or not the story is actually true in the physical sense, it is nevertheless a useful story because, in a way, it is true. Which brings me back to religion. Religion is often broken down into nothing but stories that claim to be historically real, but the atheists that I spoke to earlier would insist that the stories are not true. Even if you point out certain things that are historically accurate in, say, the Bible, they would say, yes, but fiction can too. If I wrote a fictional novel about World War II that mentioned Hitler, that wouldn't make the story true. And that's right to an extent, but they're underselling the stories. For one, this video isn't about the historical accuracy of the Bible. That's not to concede that the Bible has no historical credibility at all. I do think that the atheists oversell it, especially when they focus on 3 or 4 stories in the Bible and claim that because these stories aren't true, then the Bible must not be true at all in any of its stories. And I understand the argument is that if it's the Word of God and a perfect God wrote it, he should get all of it right and not just part of it, but what they don't seem to understand is, even if they're right and the Bible wasn't written by God and was written by man, there is no reason to think it can't be an admixture of true stories and false stories. Fiction, if you will. The assumption that if you've proven certain stories aren't true, then you have proven them all not true, doesn't really work, but does tie into the problem of wisdom that I was speaking of. Militant atheism is only the example that I focus on the most, but it isn't the only one. But to a militant atheist, the objective is to prove the Bible is not true. So they think that saying, Noah's flood can't possibly be true, is an actual argument against the historical reliability of any other part of the Bible, since if one part of the Bible is fiction, then how do you know any of the other parts of it are? Ignoring, of course, that the Bible is a composite work. It isn't really a book, but several books. One book that purports to be a history book can be entirely accurate and still be put in the same volume of one that has no historical credibility at all. But that's the problem of wisdom. Militant atheists, indeed, share this problem with evangelical Christians. And that is the assumption that either the Bible is all true or all false, and whether or not it is true depends entirely on whether or not it is historically accurate. But much like with the Ptolemaic model of the universe, they seem not to understand that wisdom should guide us both in determining whether or not Christianity or any other religion is true, not simply knowledge. Especially base knowledge. By which I mean things like, did this story really happen in history? Another example that I can use from the atheist community, and it is one of the most common, and I won't talk only about atheists, trust me, is creationism. Indeed, creationism is one of the arguments used to bolster the idea that science and religion are hostile to each other and incompatible, and at the same time is used as a justification for why the atheist attacks religion. The fact that they equate religion to Christianity is of course problematic, since not all religions are Christian or use the Bible or believe in the biblical creation account, obviously.
but when you listen to them talk, they act as if they do. And they also act as if all religion hinges on a literal reading of Genesis. Genesis, of course, being the story about creation, because they don't seem to understand that the book of Genesis actually contains more than just the creation account. And the reason I bring this up is because creationism, more than anything else, even more than Noah's flood, is used to show how irrational it is to believe in the Bible, but also used to prove that science and religion are hostile to each other and utterly incompatible. And in the end, the atheist, who is a champion of science and reason, because science improves lives and gives us truth, will use as a justification for their attacks on Christianity the fact that Christians reject science, as evidenced by the fact that they believe in the Genesis creation account and not the scientific account of evolution. Since Christians refuse to accept evolutionary theory, this means they reject science. And this is a reason that they attack religion, because it harms science. But there are two problems with this, and I've brought these problems up before, but bear with me, I'm making a very different point here. I just need to make the arguments in brief to prove said point. The first problem, of course, is that you should not equate all of science with any one given theory. Even well-established, well-respected ones that are seen as foundational to the modern scientific perspective do not determine science as a whole. Creationists don't reject science. They do reject evolution, but they do not reject science. It's not like if you start talking to them about the water cycle, they'll say, well, that's what science teaches, and science is evil and wrong. I believe in religion and the Bible instead. Creationists actually have a very positive view of science. They don't really view science as their enemy. The atheist community tends to act as if, or even outright state, that religious people hate science and wish to ban it or make it illegal, but that's not the case, just as it's not the case that they disdain logic and reason. They simply don't agree with one theory. And I know it's more than one theory if you look at it, such as Big Bang Theory and what have you, that people will invoke, but the point is, you don't have to reject all of science to reject evolution, or even evolution combined with Big Bang Theory. These two theories, whilst seminal, are not the embodiment of all science. But the atheist community seems to think of them as such, as though if you don't accept evolution, then you cannot accept science. But I also don't really think it matters, because I don't really think that the atheist opposes Christianity because of how Christianity opposes science. Even if you accept that a rejection of evolution is a rejection of science itself, you have to remember that there are many Christians who accept evolutionary theory. It's not like all Christians are in fact young Earth creationists. You would expect, then, if one of the primary driving factors behind attacking Christianity were its rejection of science, as evidenced by its rejection of evolution, for an atheist to be far more accommodating to Christians who accept evolution. But that's not what you see in the real world. In the real world, the same atheist who will complain about Christians for rejecting science by being creationists will often also attack a Christian if they find out they are not creationist. If creationism were the actual problem, why then do they attack Christians who are not creationist? Oh, they have a pretext. They will claim that Christianity is still an unworkable, irrational system. And they will also claim that you cannot be intellectually honest and be a Christian who accepts evolution. Their general claim, to be brief, is that without a literal creation and without a literal Adam and Eve, you cannot have a fall of man, and thus you cannot have original sin, and if original sin does not exist, why did Jesus die? I'm not going to go into detail about this argument, or the response to why I don't find it particularly compelling. I've done so in previous videos and will again in the future, no doubt. I'm only doing this to bring up a different issue. The point I'm bringing up now is, if they feel they must oppose Christianity because Christianity hinders scientific progress by denying science, and if they are driven by a contempt for this rejection of science by way of creationism, you would think they would be more accommodating to Christians who accept evolution, but instead they still find a reason to object and to complain, leaving the Christian, at least if you accept the basis of their argument, with only two choices: either accept creationism and deny science, or else renounce Christianity and become an atheist. And that is where the point that I wish to discuss is raised. And it goes back to wisdom. And it goes to 2 points. It goes to the fact that the atheist who makes this sort of argument, and by no means do all atheists make this sort of argument, it's really only the militant ones, lack wisdom. But what's more, if you have wisdom, you know not to take what they're saying at face value about their own motives. Allow me to explain. For starters, we'll talk about the motives, because that is the one that is most obvious. If the atheist were genuinely motivated by a love of science, and if they were primarily trying to protect things like evolutionary research, then Christian beliefs that are benign to that end would not be something they would concern themselves over too greatly. But they do. If they must counter Christians who believe in evolution, the question becomes, why? We know that they do counter them. But why do they counter them? And yes, I realize I'm not providing an argument against what they said. Again, that's not the purpose of this video. What is the purpose of this video is the realization that the atheist is driven by a need to tear down Christianity, not by a love of science and a need to defend it. The militant atheist may protest what I just said, and in fact many have. But it's obvious that you shouldn't accept what they're saying, because it doesn't add up logically. You see, they're simply looking for excuses for tearing down Christianity. And if one is wise, one knows not to take at face value the claims of people once it has become obvious that they have an ulterior motive. And the ulterior motive is very clearly displayed. Even if you don't exactly know why they wish to tear down Christianity, you know they do, and you know that any argument you advance will be rejected by them, whether or not they take the time to understand it. So, a wise person would know that a militant atheist is too strident against Christianity to genuinely be motivated by the things they claim they are motivated by. Indeed, most of the people whom you run into who use this sort of argument, and who of course use other popular and familiar arguments such as slavery in the Bible, or God being some sort of celestial dictator, or who go about saying talking snakes and talking donkeys, or saying the Bible has zombies in it, quite clearly gained these arguments after becoming atheists. They didn't become atheists because these things troubled them as Christians. They learned these arguments from other atheists, either by hearing other atheists use them and gravitating toward them themselves, or by learning about the arguments after having become atheists. And again, not all atheists are militant atheists. I'm simply using that as an example. Wisdom would tell me that I shouldn't trust what they are saying. In contrast, though, you can also ask, what is the wisdom in their criticism of Christianity? Do they gain anything by it? And I mean really gain it, not some abstraction of fighting for truth. When you look at it very specifically, they claim that religion holds back science, and they also make other claims about dictatorial governments that they must resist, but we all know this is not the reality. At the very least, we know it's not the reality of the majority of Christians you would meet. Most Christians don't want to ban the teaching of evolution. Most Christians worldwide accept evolution. And most don't want to topple the government and create a handmaiden's tale type of government, or some sort of Christian theocracy under Christian Sharia law, no different than the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They don't do that in the real world. And if you take their argument as valid, that you cannot be an intellectually honest and intellectually consistent Christian and believe in evolution, there's only a 50-50 chance, all things being equal, that the Christian will snap out of the delusion of religion and become an atheist and accept evolution. You may have actually just created a creationist through this argument. Rather than choosing science over Christianity, they may choose Christianity over science. But indeed, I don't think this is a problem for the atheist community. I think they want Christians to stay around. All the bluster about wanting it to go away is clearly not the case, since they need it to exist in order to have something to hate. Without Christianity, they will hate each other. Because what ultimately drives militant atheism is a need to feel superior to others, not an actual passion for truth. It's more about identity. And therein lies the point of wisdom. For you see, militant atheists commit a very basic fallacy. And that is the assumption that you cannot use or repurpose ideas at all to accomplish anything else. They wish to present everything as a zero-sum game. It's all or nothing, and that itself isn't wise. It's the cathedral problem. Even if no one believed in Christianity, the physical buildings of the churches and all those lovely cathedrals around Europe would still exist. Do we do as the Soviet Union did and tear them down? Do we repurpose them? Most modern Western atheists do not wish to tear down the cathedrals. They recognize them as artistic treasures and historical. But I can see them advocating for turning them into gymnasiums and museums as the Soviet Union did, or perhaps changing them to reason halls or places to teach science instead of religion. After all, during the French Revolution, Notre Dame Cathedral was turned into the Temple of Reason, where they worshipped reason, and the goddess Reason was enthroned there. Are you honestly telling me that a militant atheist couldn't do something of that same vein? But what they don't seem to understand is there is an analogy between the buildings, the cathedral, and the beliefs. And it goes back to what I was telling you earlier about Christian mythology and about the Ptolemaic universe. And that is this question. Is Christianity in any way useful? One of the problems when dealing with militant atheists, as I said, is the lack of wisdom. And as I said, this is not about atheists, but militant atheists, and ultimately not about them at all. As such, I shall return to Christianity and militant atheists in a moment. For now, I would like to talk about the other thing you're not supposed to talk about in polite company or at dinner. Politics. And believe it or not, what I'm about to tell you about politics is exactly the same thing I'm telling you about militant atheism. For you see the same pattern of thinking in politics. And it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, if you're Tory or Labour, if you're Democrat or Republican. Living in America, I shall use the Democrat and Republican as my example, but only just. Believe it or not, I have seen this pattern. If a right-wing conservative advocates for a policy, people who identify as left-wing and who are politically very active and inclined will reject his policy. On the other hand, those same left-wingers will accept a policy given to them by another left-winger, a respected one. You may think, well, that goes without saying. If you're a left-winger, you agree with the left-wing leaders, and if you're a left-winger, you're naturally going to be inclined to disagree with right-wing ideas. And that's a fair point as far as it goes, but the psychology has shown something rather interesting about politics. And that is, often, people agree with an idea simply because they know someone they like advocates it, or someone they identify with in terms of their political identity, and will reject ideas based less upon what they are, but upon who said them. There was a psychological experiment, for example, where they asked people's political opinions. They asked if they saw themselves as left-wing or right-wing or Democrat and Republican, and then they quoted a policy from someone. I believe this experiment has been done several times, in fact. It would be like if I found out someone was a Republican and then quoted something Barack Obama said about policy. And naturally the right-winger would disagree with it. But then I quote a policy by, say, Ronald Reagan, and the right-winger would agree with it. Only to reveal that both quotes were actually either invented, neither Obama nor Reagan said them, or else they were reversed. The quote that I told you was from Obama was actually from Reagan, or vice versa. The conservatives, it seems, were responding more to the name recognition than to the actual ideas and their content. They knew Reagan was a conservative icon and hero, and that they backed his policies. So if you were to tell them something was said by Reagan, they would agree with it. And the same thing happens with Obama. They reject it because Obama said it. Now, there is a certain limit to the utility of doing that. If, for example, you were to quote Reagan as saying, "I believe that abortion should be legal up to even the day before abortion," then a pro-lifer is going to reject what Reagan said, even if Reagan said it, and may even change their mind about Ronald Reagan. Conversely, if you were to quote Barack Obama saying, "I don't believe that guns should require registration at all," then some people who also agree that gun registration should not occur, but who nonetheless identify as right-wing, may say, "Well, I don't like Obama's other policies, but I agree with him here." But more than likely, red flags would go up, and they would begin to suspect that you are lying to them. There are certain expectations that we have of leaders, and sometimes if you lie too blatantly, you're caught, and if you go too far afield, even if they believe you that this person said it, they won't go along with it. And this is by no means a fault of right-wing thinkers. Left-wingers did the same thing in these experiments, where you would quote Barack Obama when it was really Ronald Reagan, and they would agree with it, thinking it's Obama, thinking it's a left-wing policy, thinking it's Democrat, when it was actually Republican. Or vice versa, rejecting it because Reagan said it. And therein lies the point. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings making decisions based upon impartial, nuanced assessment of facts, when in reality we often make emotional decisions based more upon identity and symbolism than we do based upon reason. Which brings me back to the religion example that I was giving earlier. While most atheists are not militant atheists, and indeed reject them the same way I do, militant atheists have decided that to be an atheist means to mock and attack religion, and to them religion means Christianity. They must find fault with the Bible, must find fault with Christian teaching, must find fault with Christian history, must find fault with current Christian behavior, and they are inclined to view Christians in a negative light. I myself have seen this firsthand, where the more frustrated a militant atheist becomes with me in not accepting their arguments, the more they envision me as a fundamentalist Christian stereotype rather than as the actual type of person I am. For example, I accept evolution, but they view me as a creationist simply because they don't like me. And you see this play out rather commonly on atheist websites or chat rooms or discussion boards. They will frequently demonize Christians as fitting into that idea that they wish to institute a form of theocracy in America, in which they institute the Christian version of Sharia law, and that they ban the teaching of science. They make logic and reason illegal, and advocate only for faith and all that other nonsense. They basically think The Handmaid's Tale is a realistic view of what would happen if the Christians took over. And the more they don't like me personally, the more they see me as someone longing for the Republic of Gilead, someone longing for Christian Sharia. And they don't really care if this is an accurate view of me or not, because the point of it is not to be accurate. It is to justify their hatred of me. In a broader sense, it is to justify their hatred of Christians in general. But what does all of this have to do with wisdom? Believe it or not, it has to do with one last point. And it's one that speaks to the atheist community, since they are the ones who are the most adamant that they are immune to this sort of thinking, whilst at the same time employing its language. And that is a psychological fact that we have learned. People actually prefer justice to truth. They prefer a sense of righteousness to truth. Many today believe that a desire to see the world set to rights overrides everything else. I don't believe that. I believe instead that, while it is true that we prioritize justice to truth, I also believe that we prioritize identity and desires and preferences, even to justice and righteousness. And this is why we can develop irrational bigotries and hatreds, like the one that I've illustrated with the atheist community. They don't really hate Christianity because it is wrong, factually. And they don't really hate it because it is unjust or unfair or immoral. After all, even if we were to concede that the Bible were these things, it is obvious that modern Christians are not, and the way they understand their Bible, whether or not it is correct, is nevertheless not one that can be objected to in quite as strong terms as they do. The militant atheist is not objecting to Christianity because they favor righteousness to truth, or justice to truth. They are objecting to Christianity because they have built an identity around rejecting Christianity, and ultimately they reject it simply as a means to superimpose their own form of religion, which we're not allowed to call religion, onto the world. We can bypass our sense of righteousness and justice very easily by simply choosing to interpret what is just and right and moral in such a way as to provide us with our desires, be they base carnal desires or more abstract philosophical desires. And in the end, this is a driving force behind politics, philosophy, religion. At least it is so amongst most. That is not to say that we cannot learn to temper it. Most do over time. They learn to reel it back to some extent. But the manner in which it is reeled back, as well as how much, is in question. And I believe this varies from individual to individual, but also varies within each individual depending upon the topic. One may be far more willing to set aside one's biases in favor of one thing, such as what is the best show on television, where one may become more entrenched in one's political or religious views. And this applies, as I said, to the atheist community, just as it does to any other religion, and I remind you, militant atheism is just aggressive secular humanism, and secular humanism is indeed a religion. But it is not simply secular humanists or militant atheists, nor is it just political figures. There are people even within Christianity who do much the same thing, approaching things in a rather foolish or haphazard manner. For example, there are those within the American Christian community who elevated Donald Trump to the point where he became a messianic figure, God's chosen, God's anointed. And I found that rather disturbing. Not because I'm anti-Trump, but because he is just a man, after all. And a man with some very serious moral defects. Flaws that we have first simply conditioned ourselves to acknowledge, but to overlook for the sake of political expediency, to making excuses for, to overlooking completely as if they don't exist, ignoring them, to finally making some of those behaviors into virtues and things that we should imitate. Indeed, people have begun imitating Trump's behavior, and frankly, I find that rather, shall we say, distasteful. I'm not, of course, telling you whether or not you should support Trump based upon his policies. But I am saying that you should have a realistic perspective of him. And the same goes for others. For example, if you are a conservative, you should not be so prone to believing that Barack Obama was a Muslim seeking to impose Sharia law, or that Nancy Pelosi is some sort of evil cackling witch. But liberals would need to learn the same. Donald Trump is not the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. He is not the Antichrist. He is not some flagrant evil that will destroy America and bring in racism and fascism. That's not what's going to happen with Trump. Nor was it ever going to. Nor was it even Trump's end goal or ambition. And the same applies to the atheist community. While some give lip service to claiming that they do indeed see some good things in the Bible, or perhaps some good things in Christianity, they will always claim that there is far more bad than good, to the point where it completely eclipses the good because of how bad the Bible is. But they do so predominantly because it is the Bible and because it is Christianity. And they don't really seem to have any sort of nuanced or reasonable view when it comes to religion or its utility. And I don't mean that fraudulent Seneca quote of, religion is seen by the common as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. That's not what I mean by utility. But it is interesting that quote, since it's on dozens of atheist websites, and it's always attributed to Seneca, who never actually said it. Indeed, if you read the works of Seneca, you would realize that him condemning religion would be a rather unexpected thing. But the Seneca quote is useful in regards to what I'm saying. After all, Seneca allegedly said the wise regard religion as false. And yet, the same atheist community that claims to believe things only on evidence, the same atheist community that claims to only go where the facts lead, will nevertheless quote Seneca, condemning religion as wrong, but as a tool for control, much the same way they like imagining religion being, simply because it accords with what they imagine religion to be and desire to see it. The cynic quote is false, but atheist websites repeat it. They say Seneca said it. Is that wise? Wisdom is never found in seeking only what agrees with your preconceived notions or your personal desires. And yet, this is exactly what we see, not only in militant atheism, but certainly in militant atheism. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that they are correct. And note, I said for the sake of argument. I don't agree that the Bible has no historical merit, and I don't agree with the idea that everything in it is false, or that the majority of things in it are false. Just as I don't agree with the idea of the Bible being immoral and awful and promoting terrible, terrible values. But for the sake of argument, let us assume that the way the atheist understands the Bible and what it teaches is correct. If I were to tell them they are incorrect, they will of course accuse me of using interpretation to say the Bible does not mean what it says. Which is why it's very difficult to speak to them, because you can't say, I don't agree with you about what the Bible says, without them claiming they are right and you're just a delusional fool. But by so doing, by refusing to listen to how others understand the Bible and dismissing it as a mere excuse so they don't have to admit how awful their holy book is, you also avoid the need for self-reflection on your own claims. And indeed, atheists are so accustomed to defining atheism itself as a lack of belief in a god that they now think of themselves as never making any claims at all and never carrying any burden of proof. And they never ask themselves these questions either. But I will. Let us suppose the atheist community is correct about at least some of the major issues. The Bible was not written by God, contains historical errors, and is ultimately the product of primitive societies. Does that genuinely mean that we can draw no inspiration from it, or find anything to inspire us, or to better our lives, or to enrich ourselves with it? Let us go even so far as to say Jesus himself never existed. This is a rather popular claim on many atheist sites. It's one that's not supported by historians. It's one that even many militant atheists won't go down, but many do, because, of course, if Jesus didn't exist, then Christianity is one big lie, confirming what they prefer. But let us assume they're right. Jesus didn't exist. His entire story is a fantasy. Let's even go one step further. Or rather, 12 steps further. Let us assume that Jesus' entire life story was plagiarized from previous pagan gods like Mithras and Horus and Dionysus. And let us assume that ultimately it is simply an allegory for the course of the sun through the sky through the course of a year. It's astrology. It goes through each of the constellations. It's astrotheology. Just like Gerald Massey said, just like Jordan Maxwell said, or Acharya S. Just like in the film Zeitgeist. Would any of that change the potential of Christianity to improve people's lives? While I am not conceding that all of this is true, or even that the broad claim of Jesus not existing or the Bible being false is true, I am asking this question. Even if Christianity is mythology in the way they mean it, as in, it's not true, It is also demonstrably mythology in the classical sense of the term. It is an explanatory story that transcends the historical reality to teach timeless truths and principles. The story of Jesus has been used by many to transform their own lives. Seeing in Jesus a saviour, seeing redemption, seeing freedom from their past sins, it is a way for them to undergo their own process of reformation. The story serves as a way to structure their own redemption. The story of Jesus gives them a way to understand how to escape guilt and shame and anxieties and fears that were brought about by their previous actions in life. It gives them a grounding in moral teachings. At this point, of course, the militant atheist would object and claim how immoral Christianity is, but even if the only reason modern Christians aren't burning women at the stake for witches and killing scientists and freethinkers today is because their religion has been secularized, even if that were true, even giving you that for the sake of argument, it is not a true concession. Should I view modern Christianity as evil because 500 years ago the evil Christian church murdered scientists because what they said went against the Bible? Should I deny any value to the Christian religion to modern people's lives? What's more, is it wise to reduce all of Christian history to only the bad things that it's done, as if it's done no good? I know many atheists would retort it hasn't done any good, or it's done far, far, far less good than bad. But is that genuinely a nuanced view of history? How many of them have sat down and read history? Many deny Christianity had any aspect whatsoever in developing Western society, especially since the Enlightenment. Aaron Ra, for example, says Christianity only influenced American society in two ways, and that was through misogyny and slavery. And now that we have equality for women and the abolition of slavery, the Bible and Christianity have no impact whatsoever on modern American society. But that is laughably ridiculous. It's obvious that Western civilization was built upon Christianity, and it is equally obvious that the Bible has had much more influence than just teaching you women are inferior to men and their property, and that slavery is okay. Reducing Christianity like that is not wisdom. And pretending the historical accuracy of the Bible is the sole determinant for whether or not it has any value is also not wise. I often tell those same atheists about allegorical exegesis, which was the most common way of understanding the Bible during the Middle Ages. And I'm told, well, if that story's allegory, what about other parts of the Bible? How do you know what part of the Bible is true and what parts aren't? What if Jesus never existed? What if that's an allegory too? And they don't seem to realize that not only is that a rather stupid thing to say, since you can do what they claim that they do themselves, and that is to read the Bible like any other book. People can determine figures of speech and allegory, and at the same time understand that other parts of the same book may not be that. It's not like the Bible is somehow being claimed to be unique in having both allegory and reality to it, but even if no part of the Bible is historically true, that doesn't mean that the Bible contains no truth about the human condition. Even if God himself doesn't exist, that doesn't mean God can't be a symbol or metaphor or abstraction for something that does, something that we can connect to, and it doesn't mean that the Christian framework can't be used to connect to that universal truth. And yet, the atheist community refuses to even consider that as a possibility. It is either historically accurate, or it is worthless garbage. And therein lies the conclusion of this video. I believe that the atheist community decided to object to Christianity before it sought out arguments to object to Christianity with. I believe that at this point in history, the driving force behind militant atheism is simply a blind and irrational hatred, and the appeal to militant atheism is the mythology surrounding it, that by being an atheist you prove that you're intelligent, you're more intelligent than your religious counterparts, especially those Christians, but you're not just more intelligent than them, you're more rational than them, you're more logical than them, you're better educated than them. The atheist knows the Christian's holy book better than the Christian himself does. He knows the Christian's religion better than the Christian does. He knows the Christian's history better than Christians do. And he is, of course, a more moral person. He is more moral than those awful teachings of that tyrannical God, and ultimately more moral than the Christians, too. Oh, the Christians are more moral than the God they worship. Just listen to Matt Dillahunty. But the Christians still pales in comparison to the much superior atheist. And did I mention that, since God does not exist, that means that you don't have to bow to him, you are your own person, you are free. As the quote goes, no gods, no masters. It is a very appealing thought to think of yourself as master of your own destiny and control of everything, whilst at the same time being superior to others and looking down upon them. It feels rather nice doing so. Hatred feels nice. Anger feels nice. They feel very empowering. Being angry and hostile towards Christians can make you feel very powerful indeed. And that is the trap of folly. The opposite of wisdom is not ignorance. The opposite of wisdom is folly. And I believe that the reason people fall so easily into folly, and why wisdom is so much more difficult, is because folly at least appears to give you what you want. It allows you to believe you are better than others. It allows you to believe you have no masters. It allows you to believe that you are right and they are wrong. It allows you to be confident in making decisions based upon your identity rather than the facts. Militant atheism is just an even more perverse form of this, as they claim to base all of their decisions on facts and evidence when they are clearly deriving their beliefs from a mythology and from other atheists, and ultimately from a desire to see themselves as better than others. But they are not alone. There are Christians who are just as foolish. There are Muslims who are just as foolish. There are Jews who are just as foolish. There are Hindus and Sikhs and Taoists, and Buddhists, all equally foolish. Sikhs can be equally foolish. Baha'is can be equally foolish. And I think you gather the point. Foolishness seems to derive from a desire to place yourself at the center of the universe. In a way, folly is the Ptolemaic model of the universe. You are the earth, and all else, including the sun, revolve around you. And you make all of your decisions accordingly. That's not to say that Ptolemy was a fool. He worked with what he had, and condemning him for being mistaken would be silly. But today, especially on the internet, we often make fun of flat earthers, going back, supposedly at least, to a model that has been debunked. And yet, it seems the majority of us do the same. Indeed, I believe most, if not all of us, do it at some point, although it is a question of degree. We are all using the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Ptolemy may have merely been mistaken, but there is a certain appeal to the Ptolemaic universe, a certain attraction to it. You see, the Ptolemaic universe has three features, which we find work very well in harmony with each other, and give us what we want. The first is that the Earth is the center of all the universe. The second is that the universe is not all that large. It is very comprehensible. There are 7 planets, all orbiting in a perfect circle around the Earth. Accompanying them are the Moon, the Sun, and various other things along those lines, such as comets. At the outer rim is the celestial sphere of the stars, which are the furthest away from Earth, but still rotate around it. It is a very small universe, and one that is easy to understand and navigate mentally. And what's more important, we are at its very core. And the third feature, the feature that is perhaps the selling point, it is easy to confirm it by mere observation, and it conforms to what is immediately before us. No need to investigate further. No need to ask if what we're seeing is real, no reason to ask if we're interpreting it correctly, and no reason to look for more information. It is all right there in front of us, and all around us, for it all orbits us, and we are the most important thing in the universe. This, I think, is the bedrock of all true folly. Some folly is caused by mere lack of attention, or by simply slacking off, or forgetting something, or negligence, but that isn't true folly. That is situational and incidental. True folly, endemic, systematic, inherent. True folly comes from refusing to let go of the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Granted, the world at large is so vast and so complex, and the universe around it even more so, that our modern scientific understanding of the universe may be too difficult to live with practically day by day, but we could at least enter the via media. We could at least become Copernicans, either actually or, ideally, functionally. Copernicus taught that the sun and not the earth was the center of the universe. This is not accurate. But I believe that if you have a hard time understanding the other solar systems and other stars and the vastness of creation, then you could embrace the Copernican model as a functional model, a model used to help navigate day-to-day affairs, whilst still being mindful of the fact that it is mistaken and that there is a broader world. But if you cannot make that leap, at least step into a world in which you are not the center. Militant atheists believe in the Ptolemaic model. They believe that the universe revolves around themselves and their own superior intellect, and all other ideas and beliefs and thoughts exist as nothing more than their playthings. Christians are made to be subordinate to them. All things are brought into their orbit. But how do they differ from a Christian who views themselves the same way? How do they differ from a Muslim who is willing to oppress others for not being Muslim, or a Jew willing to look down upon those who are not Jews, or even the rank-and-file racist who views others as inferior simply because of their ethnicity? How, then, is it different than those whose political ideology naturally makes them better than others? The true problem is that we are Ptolemaic, and we refuse to let go of Ptolemy. Ptolemy, I believe, was necessary. We all go through childhood, and it is impossible for a child to conceptualize in a meaningful sense the world outside of himself. But as the child grows, he becomes a Copernican. At first a true Copernican, and then a functional one, while still acknowledging a broader world. Most of us are capable of at least eventually gaining some basic awareness of the broader universe, of the sun being just one star, of the planets orbiting other stars, of a much vaster universe, but most of us cannot maintain it. They cannot think day to day, considering all of that, and they fall back on Copernicus. But so long as you recognize that this is just a model used for function, this isn't such a problem. But Ptolemy, if you are not a child, is a problem. No one above the age of 12 should believe in Ptolemy's universe. And no one above the age of 30 should believe in Copernicus's. Though over the age of 30 you may utilize Copernicus as a shorthand. But that, I believe, is the source of folly. We all too often fixate on our own little ideas and act as if we are the center of the universe. This is why militant atheists can say things like, no gods, no masters. For if you have a master, the master is the center, not you. But it is also why Christians who can give lip service to Jesus as their Lord can effectively have Jesus be a mouthpiece for their own ideas. It is why many people hold bigoted views of others. It is why the same militant atheist I spoke of earlier can't consider allegorical meanings or potential psychological benefits to religion. And it is why they will never admit to the possibility that they are wrong about what it means. How can the center of the universe be corrected by one of its subjects? Selfishness, self-centeredness, refusal to listen to others. This is the source of folly. As Proverbs 18:2 says, a fool hath no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. At least this is how it is rendered in the authorized version. also known as the King James Version. As the Buddha said, suffering is a product of desire. I don't necessarily agree with the Buddha on that point, but I do think that in principle he was onto something. I do think that much of the suffering in the world is created through selfishness, and I do think that this is also the origin of folly, and that wisdom is in removing ourselves from the center of the universe and realizing that we were never at the center of the universe to begin with. It was all an illusion. It seems to me that wisdom, then, should be understood as an abandonment of self-centeredness. Wisdom is generally understood as the right ordering of knowledge, the ability to apply correctly the knowledge you have. But I think the most important aspect of wisdom is the ability to understand others, to understand their perspectives, to not simply impose your own meanings onto them, and to not necessarily accept what they claim they mean. Discernment and insight. Those words which are often used in place of wisdom in Proverbs 4:7 in various English translations are, to me, simply parts of wisdom. They are not wisdom in itself, which is why I think the word should be translated as wisdom and not insight as it is in so many modern Bibles, or discernment as it is in a few. Because wisdom gives you the ability to discern. Wisdom gives you the ability to develop insight. Without knowledge you cannot have wisdom, but without wisdom you cannot have insight or discernment. And one of the chief things that we should know is that the way other people actually think differs often from the way they believe they think or say they think. The world isn't always the way we want it to be, and it doesn't always work the way we think it does or should. Neither do people always really mean what they say or think the way they claim to think. Wisdom comes not in simply a pure rejection of the self, but also in an effort to see past the veil of illusion and to look at things accurately and fairly, not based upon our own selfishness and not based upon the way they are presented to us from others. Wisdom is about casting aside illusion and finding the truth. And I think that when all is said and done, this is the highest priority. But I do think that the chiefest point is to abandon selfishness. We must leave behind Ptolemy and go to Copernicus. And we must go past Copernicus to the modern astronomical model. And if we cannot, in our day-to-day life, make that work, we may cling to Copernicus as a functional guide, so long as we every once in a while remind ourselves that the other model, the modern cosmological model, is indeed the more accurate. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. I hope this has been edifying, and I hope that you have gotten something from it. Until then, thank you, God bless, and goodbye.